I've told you many times before that sometimes you have to listen to what I need to hear. This morning may be one of those times. I'm pretty sure I'm not the best person to deliver this lesson, and maybe I should have handed it off to Clay. He's probably better equipped to do this one than I am, but nonetheless, it's something that's been kind of rolling around in my head for quite some time. Because I believe that selfishness is the common cause of a lot of the problems that we face in life. Physical and certainly spiritual. I hope that this lesson will help not only you, but also help me to do a better job of being selfless as God would have us to be and as the example of Christ would indicate that we should be, rather than selfish as Satan is. There was an Irish writer and poet by the name of Oscar Wilde. You may be familiar with some of his work, maybe not. He became London's most popular playwright in the late 1890s. And with regard to selfishness, he said, selfishness is not living as one wishes to live. It is asking others to live as one wishes to live. And as I saw that quote and I thought about it, I said, that's almost right. As Bob Bucher would say, he missed it by that much. Instead, and perhaps a little bit more specifically, I believe selfishness is expecting or demanding that others conform to, that others help, and others provide us with the ability to live as we want to live. Selfishness is not just expecting other people to live like we do. Selfishness is wanting other people or requiring or demanding that other people help us to live the way we want to live. Because it's all about me, you know. And therefore everyone else either needs to accept the way I want to live and let me live as I am, or help me to live, or enable me to live as I really want to live. With apologies to you ladies, Jane Austen didn't get it right when she wrote, selfishness must always be forgiven, you know, because there is no hope of a cure. That's not true. There is hope of a cure. But selfishness will never be cured as long as we continue to cater to it. It must be corrected rather than catered in order to cure. There is a cure for selfishness, and I think we can find it in the Scriptures this morning, and I hope that you will look with me. How is it that selfishness is the common cause of most of our problems? I've chosen 4 areas to illustrate this point this morning, and hopefully by looking at these, we will come to an understanding of not only how is it that selfishness provides the problems, that in identifying the problem as being selfishness, we also identify the cure as selflessness in each of these relationships. Think about marriage for a moment. We'll get back to this question in just a moment, but how many of the problems that we face in marriage, that exist in our marriages, are directly related to selfishness? Marriages are pleasing to God, and I think more pleasing to us as well, when the participants truly enjoy meeting one another's needs. When we as spouses can enjoy and find pleasure in meeting the needs of our spouse. that will be a happy marriage. We have to understand that this is a learned skill, a developed ability, if you will. In Titus, the 2nd chapter, Paul wrote to Titus concerning the older women and said that they need to teach the younger women to love their husbands. Well, the question that becomes obvious from that is, well, if they're your husband, don't you already love them? That's not what Paul's talking about exactly. Paul is talking about loving a husband when he is not lovable. Paul is talking about learning to love children when they're not being lovable. It's a learned skill for the husband as well, because in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, in 1 Peter 3 and in verse 7, it says, "You husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." Now think with me for just a moment. Why is it that Peter is writing this to husbands? Because it's not too late for them to learn to live with their wives in an understanding way. To grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. So what I'm getting at is that this is a learned skill. It's a learned ability to learn to draw pleasure from pleasing your spouse, whether you're the wife or whether you're the husband. This is the nature of the kind of love that is supposed to be indicative within marriage. In Ephesians, the 5th chapter, in Ephesians chapter 5, notice the text there, and we're only going to read a couple of these verses. This is a familiar passage to you. In Ephesians 5 and in verse 25, it says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she should be holy and blameless." The kind of love that is being described here is agapeo, agape love, if you will. Agape, as we've talked about before, seeks the best interest of its object rather than itself. Let me repeat that. Agape seeks the best interest of its object rather than itself. So agape love is by nature selfless rather than selfish. Now, when we look at this passage and understand the example of Christ from marriage, Christ lived and died selflessly for his spiritual bride, the church. Notice the text again. "Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it," that's selfless, "that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing." It was never about the sanctification of Christ, the cleansing of Christ, the washing with water of Christ, the glory of Christ. It was all about her. That's the selfless nature of agape. It's supposed to be the basis of our relationship to one another in marriage, just as it was the basis of Christ's relationship to the church. Now, let me ask you a simple question. What are the most common problem areas in marriage? Most common, think big picture. Big picture. What's the most common problem areas in marriage? What are the hot button topics, if you will, when marriage counselors have to do their job? What is it that everybody wants to talk about? Year in and year out, for the most part, studies will tell you that it's sex, money, and in-laws, and usually in that order. Now think about it. Which one of those three common problematic areas of marriage is not directly tied to selfishness? Do couples who have as their primary objective to please their spouse in that first category. Do they have problems? No, they've learned to be selfless rather than selfish. They're not always talking about my needs, my wants, and my desires. They're interested in pleasing their spouse. What about in regard to money? Well, I need more money for my hobby. You're spending too much money on your clothes, your shoes, your golf clubs, your hunting lease, whatever. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Those money problems that we have in marriage, between spouses, are usually directly tied to selfishness. What about in-laws? Well, we always spend the holidays with your mother and your dad. We always spend the holidays with your family in the summertime. We never see my parents. You're way too close to your mother. You're not spending enough time with me. Do you see how every problem that we have in marriage is in greater or lesser degrees, and more greater than lesser, directly tied to selfishness? Each partner is more concerned with their own needs, their own wants, and their own desires than they are with the needs, wants, and desires of their spouse. Now let me ask you a simple question that we begin with. How many marriages are destroyed by simple selfishness? Many spouses, especially husbands, well, I can't even say that. Most husbands and most wives would gladly die to protect their spouse. How many of them will actually live selflessly to please their spouses? You want to have a happy marriage? Learn to love selflessly in all respects, in all applications. I guarantee you it will be more pleasing to God, and you'll be happier too. What about your friends and acquaintances? What about problems with them? I used to have a sign on my desk that said, "The only consistent feature in all your dissatisfying relationships is you." The problem with that sign was that it wasn't facing me, it was facing outward on my desk, and that probably wasn't a good thing. But think about it for a moment. If you have trouble getting along with and making friends with other people, at some point we have to look inwardly and say the only consistent feature of all my dissatisfying relationships is me. I may be the issue here. And selfishness, therefore, may be the culprit. So again, let's ask the question at the beginning and at the end, how many friendships are destroyed because of simple but persistent selfishness? I want you to think with me for a moment about which of these two would be most apt to be the description your friends would give of you or of their relationship with you. Would they describe you as demanding or generous in their association with you? Now, I got to tell you, let me get over here on the confessional for just a moment. I came up with these, and this was the most difficult part of the sermon for me to write. I sat there and stared at the computer screen, and I would change them, and I would go back, and I would rework them, and I would look for the right words. But these words came mostly from looking at me. On the red side, not the blue side. Would your friends describe you and their relationship with you as demanding or generous? Maybe related, certainly, but not exactly the same thing. Are you a giver or a taker? Do you provide to the relationship with your friends? Or on the other hand, are you always demanding that they give to you and therefore you become the taker in the relationship? Do they have to be your friend, in other words, without you really being their friend? Dominating or equitable? Conversations, direction of activities. I left it purposefully vague as far as the applications are concerned. Would they describe their relationship with you and therefore with you as, and therefore you as dominating or equitable? Fair? Controlling or liberating? Does everything always have to be manipulated by you to come out the way you want it? And your friends just have to follow along? Or do you allow them to be who they are and to enjoy who they are and to celebrate with them who they are? Or do you have to try to put them into your little box of what you think they should be? Needy or empathetic? Whether it's of attention, sympathy, whatever. Are you the needy one in the relationship? Or are you the empathetic one that is providing? There's a difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is feeling sorry for someone else. Empathy is more taking on their hurt so that you hurt also, to the degree that you want to do something about it. Doesn't take much to feel sorry for somebody else who's having a hard time. It's a different matter to empathize with them. That's weeping with those who weep. Where are you in the relationship with your friends? Are you the needy one? Are you the one to whom everyone else turns because you're empathetic? What about abusive or compassionate? And these are not the words you may have put together. I realize that. That's okay. Again, I struggle with this. These may not be the best ones that could be listed. But I hope all of these make us stop and think about how others would characterize their relationships with us and therefore us in that relationship. Would they describe you as judgmental or supportive? Now, I'm not talking about right and wrong issues here. I'm talking about a new hairstyle or a color of a car that you decide to buy or whatever. Oh, I would have never done that. I can't believe you did that. Or, I think that looks pretty good. That's a new thing for you. Maybe it's time for you to change up. How are you within those relationships? Are you selfish or selfless toward your friends? Matthew 7 and verse 12 is the golden rule. With regard to your friends and your acquaintances, do you treat them the way you would want to be? How long would they remain your friends if they treated you the way you treat them? Would you unfriend them if they treated you the way you treat them? In 1 Peter 3 and in verses 8 and 9, he's just finished up talking about servants and masters and husbands and wives. And notice what he says in 1 Peter 3 and in verse 8. To sum up, let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. Look at those verses. And look at the adjectives that are utilized there. And to some degree, the adverbs that describe actions that we have one to another. Are those descriptive of you? Or are you over here on the red side of the ledger? Have you had friends say to you something along the lines of, "You're just too selfish. I don't want to be your friend anymore"? I've found someone who's a better friend to me than you've ever been. In Philippians 2 and in verse 3, it says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." Now, you be honest. Can you do that in your current state of mind, in your current state of being? We've been conditioned for a decade or two or three to be the me generation. Can you really do what Philippians 2 and verse 3 says when it says you regard another as more important than self? If we can't, then we won't do verse 4 either, which says, "Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others." And we certainly won't follow with the attitude of Christ in verses 5 and following in that text. We sometimes sing, "What a friend we have in Jesus." Think about the words of that song and ask yourself if you're that kind of friend to your friends. He's the example of what friendship should be to us. Do we reciprocate His friendship by sharing it with others in the same kinds of ways? Third application. What about our brethren? And I'll caution you from the very outset, we're not going to read all of these passages. I'm going to throw some things up that we're only going to pick and choose from. But think about it again and ask the same question. How many problems exist in local congregations that are directly related to selfishness? How many church fights get started over selfishness? Because someone insists on my way, even in matters of judgment. Well, I know it's a matter of judgment, but this is the right way. Wait a minute, what was that again? If it is a matter of judgment, that means there's not a right way or a wrong way. Because if there was a right and a wrong way, that would mean God had said so. That means it's not a matter of judgment anymore. As you read through Romans 14, and we're not going to do that, I would like you to read with me, though, Romans 15. There's a lot of emphasis placed on Romans chapter 14, and rightfully so. But sometimes we fall short in that we think the thought ends in chapter 14, and it doesn't. The conclusion of all of those things that are talked about in Romans 14 is matters of faith and matters of judgment, and how those things are to interrelate one to another are culminated in chapter 15. When it says in chapter 15 and verse 1, "Now we who are strong ought to bear the weakness of those without strength and not just please ourselves." The strong ought to do what? What's he saying? Defer to the weak in these matters of judgment. Verse 2, "Let us not please ourselves, let each of us please his neighbor for his own good, to his edification. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproach thee fell upon me. Whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, that through the perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." Now look at verse 5. "Now may the God who gives perseverance and encouragement grant you to be of the same mind with one another, according to Christ." We can't be of the same mind toward one another if I'm more important than you are and you think you're more important than I am. Verse 6, "That with one accord you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Wherefore accept one another, just as Christ also accepted us in the glory of God." He's still talking about matters of judgment, not matters of faith. He's not talking about accepting someone who continues and insists on living in sin. He's talking about someone who has a different opinion than you do, a different judgment than you do. If I'm insisting on my way, or I'll just take my membership and I'll go somewhere else, that's selfishness. In 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, in the first 8 verses of that chapter, he talks about it and chastises the Corinthians because they have gotten to the point in their selfish immaturity. Go back and read chapter 3, the first 3 verses. In their selfish immaturity, that they're actually taking one another to court. And he says that is being done before unbelievers. So you've got two brethren getting so upset with one another, and each emphasizing his own rights to the degree that they actually create a court case before a heathen judge. Why? He says, wouldn't it be better just to be wronged? Wouldn't it better just to be defrauded? The obvious answer that he's implying there is yes. Wouldn't it be better, as Jesus said, to just turn the other cheek? You've been wronged. You've been defrauded. Okay. Are you going to make it worse? How is that going to reclaim the relationship that you formerly had with your brother who has defrauded you by you now taking him to court and creating more controversy, more drama? Well, what he did to me is just not right. I know that. That's not the question. The question is not whether or not what he did was right. The question is whether or not what you're going to do is right in response. In Romans, the 12th chapter, and in verse 16, it says, "Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone." Now, what I'm wanting you to see is from this passage in Romans 12 and verse 16 is that being of the same mind toward one another and associating with the lowly and not being wise in your own estimation, he's talking about selflessness versus selfishness, and he makes application in verses 17 through 21 of that principle, of that comparison. Notice verse 17. "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men." Which one does that? Who pays back evil for evil, the selfish or the selfless? Who likewise respects what's right in the sight of all men, the selfish or the selfless? Verse 19. "If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men." Who does that? The selfless or the selfless? The selfish or the selfless? Don't laugh at me. You try saying those words this many times in a sermon. Verse 19, "Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.'" Which one of those two does it? The selfish or the selfless? Verse 20, "If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink." Which one does that? Oh no, he's my enemy. I've got him down. I'm going to put my foot on his neck now. Verse 21, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Again, the selfless or the selfish? Which one is it? All of these are very much interrelated. In Philippians, the 2nd chapter, we referred to the example of Christ and so on and so forth from on down in the text. I want you to back up to Philippians chapter 2, the first 4 verses there, and get the basis for what he's saying with this example of Christ. In Philippians 2 and in verse 1, "If therefore there is any encouragement in Christ," if there's any consolation, we like encouragement, we like consolation. "If there's any fellowship," we like fellowship. And fellowship doesn't mean to eat necessarily. "If there's any affection and compassion," we like all of those things. "Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose." Now look at verse 3. "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." You can't get to verse 3 without having the proper attitude and desire for the things in verses 1 and 2. Encouragement, consolation, fellowship, affection, compassion, joy, unity. You're not going to get to the attitude of verse 3 unless you have those characteristic desires of verses 1 and 2. And you'll certainly never get to verse 4, which means you're able to consider one another as more important than self. If we take a me-first attitude, we'll never get there. Do you remember the mother of James and John coming to Jesus in Matthew the 20th chapter and asking that her son sat on the right and the left hand of Christ in his kingdom? Yeah, okay, you got that. Matthew 20, right? Matthew 20, verse 20 beginning. What does verse 24 say? Verse 24 of Matthew 20 says that the other disciples became indignant at those two brothers. Why? Because they were taking a me-first attitude. They wanted to be second and third in this case in the kingdom. Jesus was going to be first, but we want to be second and we want to be third. They went to him privately and made that kind of request. And then when the other disciples found out that they had tried to elevate themselves, they thought more of themselves. That means they were being selfish. It caused strife among the 12 disciples. Guess what? It has the same effect in local congregations of brethren. When someone takes a me-first attitude or even a me-second and third above everybody else attitude, there are going to be problems. In James, the 3rd chapter, and we're not going to spend much time on this. I think you've gotten the point on this particular application by now. In James chapter 3, he talks about selfish ambition twice in this passage. James 3, verse 13, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition," those two are linked. Bitter jealousy and selfish ambition just go together like hand and glove. Because when there's selfish ambition, there's probably going to be bitter jealousy. He says, "This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing." What you're seeing is the complete opposite of the unity that God expects within the local church. So I ask you again the question: how many local fellowships are either prevented from having or destroy what God intended them to have in the local church fellowship through selfishness? The latter part of Ephesians 4 talks about how we should speak to one another. And then in chapter 5, in the first 2 verses, it says that we should be imitators of Christ. The selfless Christ. Finally, let's talk about our relationship with our God. How does selfishness affect that relationship? Anybody remember those bumper stickers that came out several years ago that said, "God is my co-pilot"? I thought that was the most ridiculous bumper sticker I'd ever seen. I like the one that came out later that said, "If God is your co-pilot, you need to switch seats." That's more to the point. But why would somebody think God is their co-pilot? He's helping me fly. Really? Let me ask you, whose will really dominates your life? I'm not talking about on Sunday morning when it's time to go to Bible class or worship. I'm talking about whose will dominates your life day to day, hour by hour, minute by minute. Is it really Matthew 6 and verse 33 for you, which says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you"? Is it really Ephesians 5 and in verse 10, which talks about trying to learn that which is pleasing to God? Or do you want just enough of God's will to save you eternally, but not enough of it to mess up your life or make you some sort of holier-than-thou goody two-shoes? I don't want to be some sort of weird religious fanatic. I just want to be saved. I don't want to be lost. I don't want to spend eternity. Did you hear the word "I" in all of those? None of them was about service to God, to Christ, to the Spirit of God, or to our fellow man. They were all about me. I don't want to go to hell. I don't want my life to be messed up by all this religion. Whose will is it that dominates your life? Oh, it's His. Unless it disagrees with mine. This is a God of subjection. He's my God unless and until He tells me to do something that I don't really want to do. That's not what I think is the right thing. I've talked about this before, but I really want to emphasize, and I want you to think about it in this connection now again. There's really no subjection as long as there's agreement. I don't care whether you're talking about church members and elders, or wives to husband, or citizens to the government, or individuals to God. There's really no subjection as long as there is agreement. Because when there is agreement, I'm doing this not because you told me to and I'm subjecting myself to your will, but because I think it's the right thing. The only real test of subjection is disagreement. That I'm going to do what He says when I don't think it's the thing that ought to be done. When I don't understand why He wants me to do it. When I don't agree that this is the best thing for me in my life. That's a God of subjection. Do you still pray for God's will to be done when it is not the same as your will? We just studied in our Wednesday night Bible class from Matthew 26. In verse 39. Jesus' prayer on the night that He was betrayed. Not my will be done, but thine. What did He say before that? Let this cup pass from me. If there's any other way, God, for me to accomplish your purposes without the cross being involved, without this separation and my taking on the sins of the world in whatever form that implies, if there's some other way, can we do it that way? But not my will, yours. Is that the way we pray? Do we still pray for God's will to be done when it's not the same as our own will? We only pray for His will to be done when we've already agreed and put our stamp of approval on it. It's His will if it isn't too difficult or demanding. The other one was a God of subjection. This was a God of convenience. As in, I'll serve Him as long as it is convenient to me. When we go back and read Luke 14 and verse 24, there were great multitudes of people that were following after Jesus in Luke 14 and verse 24. And then what did He begin to tell them in verse 25? If you really want to be my followers, you're going to have to hate your father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. You're going to have to take up your cross daily and follow after me. That's not a God of convenience saying that. He's not talking about serving Him and subjecting ourselves to His will just when it's easy or convenient for us. I'll serve Him as long as it is not too inconvenient for me. As long as it's easy. Well, Jesus said, my load is easy, my burden is light. Yeah, that's not what He's talking about, folks. What about it's His will as long as things go well and I still get most of everything I want in and from life? We've talked about a God of subjection, where His will is subjected to ours. We've talked about a God of convenience, that we're willing to submit to His will as long as it's easy and not too difficult for us. This one is the God of provision. This is a view of God as some sort of celestial Santa Claus, that as long as He keeps putting everything under my tree I want, that I'll keep praying to Him and I'll keep calling Him my God. But when things don't go the way that I want, and I don't get what I think I deserve out of life, then I'm done with this God. I'm not going to serve a God who treats me this way. Was that the attitude of Job? It wasn't the attitude of Job, but it was the attitude of those people in John 6 who were following after Jesus in those great multitudes, and He fed 5,000 of them at one time. And then He said, you're following me just because of the loaves and the fishes. They'd made a God of provision out of Him. When they began to understand and listen to the words that Jesus was speaking, they didn't care anything more about that. It wasn't easy. It wasn't convenient. He wasn't providing for them what they wanted anymore. They only were interested in the physical things. They didn't want all that spiritual mumbo-jumbo. The bad line is they wanted the seafood gumbo. How many personal relationships with God have been either A, abandoned, or B, destroyed because God didn't do what I thought He should have done for me or to me? Which makes God again subjective, convenient, and provisional to me. Now do we see how selfishness is the most common cause of most all of our problems? Whether we're talking about it in our husband and wife relationships, with our friends, with our brethren, or with our God, it almost always comes back to selfishness. Since we started with a couple of quotes from somewhat famous people, let's end with one more. Ladies, if you're looking for a children's name, Ewart is available. You name that little boy Ewart, and there won't be another one in kindergarten like that, I guarantee you. William Ewart Gladstone was Prime Minister of Britain 4 separate times. He lived from the early 1800s until the late 1800s, died in 1898. He said, selfishness is the greatest curse of the human race. I don't know about his religion. I know he's a member of the Liberal Party in London, but that doesn't mean the same thing back then there as it does here now. But I know he's right about this. How do I know he's right about that? If we're going to put any stock in human quotes, he's the one that got it right. Because selflessness is God's way, it's God's nature that we saw manifested in human form. Hebrews, the 1st chapter, tells us that Jesus has explained. He is the exact representation of the nature of God in human form. God is a selfless God. And we can only be His children when we cure ourselves through His will and through His power of selfishness. Because that's completely foreign to His nature. We're going to have to get away from allowing selfishness to destroy our relationships with our spouses, with our friends, with our brethren, and with our God. Or we will have an eternity to spend with the most selfish people and beings that have ever lived. Is that your idea of a good time? Selfishness and selflessness seem to me to be related to almost every aspect of life and godliness. May God help you and me to be more like Christ, less like ourselves if we're selfish. If we can help you this morning, you come while we stand.
A few more happy days and then I'll fly away to a land where joy shall not end. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah.